This is a question of great importance. The first thing we have to establish is, are those kinds of claims actually present in the Bible? And it is without any great difficulty provable that Jesus made those kinds of claims. Perhaps the most explicit expression of those claims comes in John 8 and John 10 and John 17. In those passages, Jesus claims to have existed from eternity. He says, before Abraham was, I am, which is a claim to an eternal existence, using the very words that are used as part of the name of God in the Old Testament, the name Yahweh, I am. And he prays in John 17 that the Father will restore him to the glory that he always had with the Father before the world existed. A very explicit claim to an eternal existence as God. But it's not all in the Gospel of John. We also find, for example, in Mark 2, that Jesus makes the startling statement to someone who is a paralyzed person on a stretcher, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And the Jews who were standing there were immediately offended, thinking, who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus then responded, so that you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, and then turns to the paralyzed man and heals him. He stands up and walks. So there's the healing, which is quite remarkable, but more than that, there is the claim to have the right to forgive sins on earth. Not long after this event with the healing of the paralytic, after forgiving his sins, we find Jesus in a boat with his disciples making his way across the Sea of Galilee when a terrific storm comes upon them. The amazing thing is Jesus was asleep in the boat. And as the waves rose and the winds blew, the disciples became afraid the boat would capsize and they'd all drown. So they wake Jesus up. Don't you care? We're perishing. And Jesus' response was to stand up and to rebuke the storm, the wind and the waves, and immediately a great stillness came upon the sea. The response of the disciples was, who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? Which of course is a recognition that there's divine power there. There is a passage as well in Matthew's gospel in which Matthew records a prayer of Jesus which has remarkable similarities to the one we find in John 17. And in this prayer, Jesus prays, all things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him. This is a remarkable passage because Jesus claims not simply the authority of a prophet to speak for God, to reveal God, but he claims the authority to establish a relationship between a human and God, and says that God himself ordains this relationship between humans and himself. So this is a very strong claim to deity. But, you ask, are those sayings really authentic? Did Jesus actually say those things, or were those things added later, so to speak, put into his mouth? It's an extremely important fact that the proclamation, the teaching, the preaching of what we call the gospel, the good news about Jesus, began immediately after his crucifixion and resurrection. There wasn't a long period of time where things could kind of grow up into some kind of legend. There's way too little time for legend or myths to enter into this equation at all. In fact, the Gospels themselves were written in the lifetime of the people who were witnesses to Jesus. So any discrepancy between what Jesus actually said and did and what was written would have created a great disagreement, a great conflict. And that never came about because what was proclaimed by the apostles right after the death and resurrection of Jesus is the same thing that's written in the Gospels, in the New Testament. So we have both the closeness of the events to the proclamation of the events and the documentation of the events, all saying the same thing, affirming one another, so that there's really no reason, no plausible reason to say Jesus' claims weren't from his mouth, but from people much later. In fact, they came from him, and we have excellent evidence of that.